In March of 1856, in the fertile valleys of Millbrook County, Pennsylvania, a spring flood washed away 40 feet of Daniel Whitlock's eastern cornfield, revealing what the county coroner would later describe as a cathedral of bones. 17 complete human skeletons were found arranged in perfect rows, their remains calcified and fused with the soil itself. The victims, ranging in age from 7 to 63 years old, had been missing from surrounding townships for nearly 2 decades. What investigators discovered next would shake the agricultural heartland to its core. Whitlock's legendary harvests, corn stalks that grew 12 feet tall, wheat that yielded triple the regional average, tomatoes the size of melons, had all been nourished by human remains. For 19 years, the most successful farmer in western Pennsylvania had been grinding his victims into bone meal and tilling them into his fields. The records of the Whitlock investigation were sealed by court order in 1857 and buried in the basement archives of the Harrisburg Capitol building. They remained untouched for 167 years, until a renovation crew discovered them wrapped in oilcloth, hidden behind a false wall. The documents revealed not just the crimes of one man, but an entire network of agricultural practitioners who had been operating across 5 states, trading in what they called premium soil amendments. Among the recovered papers was Whitlock's personal ledger, written in his precise farmer's hand. Each entry documented a name, a date, and a single chilling notation, rendered for eastern field, or applied to wheat acreage, or simply processed. The final entry, dated March 2, 1856, just 3 days before the flood, read, "Young Timothy Brennan, aged 9. Exceptional calcium content, reserved for spring tomatoes." But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was a letter from the Pennsylvania Agricultural Society, dated 1851, awarding Daniel Whitlock their highest honor for revolutionary techniques in soil enrichment. The Society's board of directors had toured his farm. They had walked those fields. They had tested that soil. And in their official report, they noted only that Whitlock's proprietary fertilizer blend produced remarkable results worthy of replication across the Commonwealth. How many knew? How many chose to look away? And most unsettling of all, how many farmers across Pennsylvania had followed Whitlock's revolutionary techniques to the letter? Before we continue with Daniel Whitlock's descent into agricultural madness, if this story intrigues you, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting that notification bell. We uncover the darkest chapters of American history that others are too afraid to explore. I want to build a community of truth seekers here, so tell us in the comments, what state or city are you from? Has your hometown ever buried its dark secrets? Our research suggests that Whitlock's methods spread far beyond Pennsylvania, and your local historical societies might be sitting on similar sealed records. This channel is for the brave ones, the true mystery seekers who aren't afraid to look into the abyss of human nature. We don't sensationalize, we reveal. We don't exploit, we expose. And trust me, what we're about to uncover about the Whitlock farm and its connection to a multi-state conspiracy will challenge everything you thought you knew about America's agricultural golden age. Remember, only the bravest make it to the end of these investigations. Are you ready to discover what really grew in those fields? Millbrook County in 1837 was experiencing what local newspapers called the Great Awakening of Agriculture. The population had swelled from 3,200 souls in 1830 to nearly 8,000 by the time Daniel Whitlock purchased his 240-acre plot along Crimson Creek. The Erie Canal extension had just connected the region to eastern markets, and suddenly, Pennsylvania farmers could ship their produce to Philadelphia, New York, and Boston at unprecedented profits. The county seat of Millbrook proper was a thriving town of 1,100 residents, boasting 2 churches, a Presbyterian and a Methodist, 3 general stores, a postal station, 2 blacksmiths, and notably the region's first agricultural exchange building, a grand 2-story brick structure where farmers gathered monthly to share techniques, trade seeds, and arrange shipments. The exchange's founder and president was none other than Judge Harrison Whitlock, Daniel's older brother, a man who had served 2 terms in the state legislature and whose portrait still hangs in the county courthouse. Daniel Whitlock arrived in this prosperity as a young man of 23, carrying a letter of introduction from the Philadelphia Agricultural College, where he had studied what they called scientific farming, a new discipline combining chemistry, botany, and soil management. The locals initially viewed him with the suspicion reserved for educated outsiders, but that changed quickly when he purchased the old Brenneman farm, a notorious patch of dead land that had been abandoned after 3 consecutive years of failed harvests. The transformation was remarkable. Within 2 growing seasons, Whitlock had turned the barren fields into the most productive farmland in the county. His methods seemed revolutionary yet accessible. He spoke at the agricultural exchange about crop rotation, about the importance of letting fields lie fallow, about his special composting techniques that required grinding organic matter into fine powder before application. He even published a pamphlet, The Modern Farmer's Guide to Soil Restoration, which sold 500 copies across Pennsylvania and Ohio. By 1845, Daniel Whitlock employed 14 farmhands, more than any other single farm in the region. He paid them well, $1.25 per day compared to the regional average of 90 cents, and provided lodging in a newly constructed dormitory behind his main house. His workers were notably transient, often consisting of Irish immigrants fleeing the potato famine, freed slaves heading north, or displaced Native Americans from the forced removals. The high turnover was explained by Whitlock's exacting standards. He was known to dismiss workers who couldn't maintain his rigorous schedules. The social structure of Millbrook County operated on unwritten rules of respectability and reciprocity. The Whitlock brothers sat at its apex, Harrison with his legal and political influence, Daniel with his agricultural success and generous patronage of local causes. Daniel donated new pews to both churches, funded the expansion of the schoolhouse, and every harvest season, he hosted a feast for the entire town, serving beef, pork, and vegetables from his miraculous fields. Dr. Elias Morton, the county's only physician and later the man who would first suspect the truth, wrote in his 1854 diary, D. Whitlock's generosity knows no bounds. Today he brought me 3 bushels of potatoes for the poor house, each tuber the size of a man's fist. When I asked his secret, he merely smiled and said, Doctor, the earth provides when we feed it properly. There is something peculiar in his manner when discussing his farming, an intensity that borders on religious fervor. The isolation of rural Pennsylvania in the 1840s and 50s cannot be overstated. News traveled slowly, missing persons were common enough to hardly warrant investigation, and the general assumption was that those who disappeared had simply moved on, gone to California for gold, fled debts, or succumbed to any number of natural dangers. The county sheriff, Magnus Halst, kept a missing persons ledger, but it was treated more as a curiosity than a cause for alarm. Between 1837 and 1856, 43 people were reported missing in Millbrook County. 26 were eventually found or accounted for. The other 17 would later be discovered in Whitlock's eastern field. The economic importance of Whitlock's farm created a powerful disincentive to ask questions. By 1850, his produce accounted for nearly 15% of the county's total agricultural export value. The Pennsylvania Railroad had even constructed a special spur line to his property to facilitate shipments. When occasional rumors surfaced about strange smells from his fields at night, about workers who left suddenly without collecting wages, about the peculiar white powder he mixed into his soil, they were dismissed as jealousy from less successful farmers. The very structure of agricultural life provided perfect cover. Farming was brutal, private work. Fields were vast, boundaries were respected, and what a man did on his own land was his business. The grinding of bones for fertilizer wasn't even unusual. Many farmers used animal bones. The innovation Whitlock claimed was his special processing method, grinding the material finer than anyone else, mixing it with specific proportions of lime and ash, and applying it according to lunar cycles he had calculated himself. This was the world that allowed Daniel Whitlock to operate undetected for nearly 2 decades. A world of progress and isolation, of scientific advancement and primitive communication, of community trust and individual privacy. A world where the most successful farmer in the county could salt his fields with the dead, and everyone who ate from his harvest could convince themselves they tasted nothing but the rewards of honest labor. Daniel Whitlock crafted his public persona with the same meticulous attention he applied to his soil preparations. Standing 6 feet tall with premature silver streaking his dark beard, he cut an impressive figure at agricultural exchange meetings, where he would demonstrate his soil testing techniques using glass vials and chemical reagents imported from Philadelphia. He spoke with the measured cadence of an educated man, but retained enough rural colloquialisms to avoid seeming pretentious. His cover story was brilliantly simple. Whitlock claimed to have discovered a method of accelerated decomposition that could turn any organic matter into fertile soil amendment within weeks rather than months. He maintained 3 large covered compost structures on his property, wooden buildings with specially designed ventilation systems that he said maintained optimal temperature and humidity for his proprietary process. Visitors were politely but firmly discouraged from entering these structures. Whitlock explained that introducing outside air could disrupt the delicate bacterial balance essential to his method. The first crack in Daniel Whitlock's facade appeared in October of 1854, when Mary Hutchinson, the Methodist minister's wife, came to Dr. Elias Morton with an unusual concern. Her nephew Samuel had been working at the Whitlock farm for 3 months when he suddenly appeared at her door at 2 in the morning, fevered and speaking incoherently about the grinding house and the white dust that screams. The boy, hardly 17, had fled the farm on foot, running 6 miles through the autumn darkness. Dr. Morton's medical notes from that night, recovered from his personal effects, describe Samuel's condition. Patient presents with acute nervous exhaustion, pupils dilated, hands trembling uncontrollably. Multiple abrasions on palms consistent with climbing or desperate grasping. Most peculiar, a fine white powder embedded under his fingernails that he begged me to remove, claiming it was from them. When pressed for clarity, patient became hysterical, requiring laudanum for sedation. Samuel Hutchinson never fully recovered his faculties. Within a week, his aunt had sent him to live with relatives in Ohio, explaining to concerned townspeople that the boy had suffered a nervous collapse from overwork. Whitlock himself visited the Hutchinson home, expressing deep concern and leaving a generous sum for Samuel's care. He explained that the boy had been asked to help with lime processing, dangerous work that sometimes produced harmful fumes if proper precautions weren't taken. The explanation satisfied most, but Dr. Morton made a note in his journal. Whitlock's composure was absolute, too absolute. A normal man would show more distress at causing such harm to a worker. The second incident occurred 4 months later, in February of 1855. Thomas Brennan, a widowed carpenter, approached Sheriff Magnus Halst about his missing son, Timothy. The boy had been sent to deliver lumber to the Whitlock farm 3 weeks prior and never returned. Whitlock claimed the boy had completed the delivery and left, suggesting he might have run off to join relations in Pittsburgh. Hadn't Thomas mentioned his late wife's family there? But Thomas Brennan was persistent. He organized search parties, posted notices, and most significantly, he discovered that Timothy wasn't the first child to disappear after visiting the Whitlock farm. Over the past 5 years, 3 other children from neighboring townships had vanished under similar circumstances, all last seen heading toward or leaving Whitlock's property. Each time, there had been reasonable explanations. The Hendricks girl had likely drowned in Crimson Creek during spring flooding. The Nowak boy, a Polish immigrant's son, had probably returned to relatives in Baltimore. The Negro child from the Clearfield settlement had most certainly been reclaimed by Southern bounty hunters. Sheriff Halst, under pressure from Thomas Brennan and growing whispers in the community, paid an official visit to the Whitlock farm in March of 1855. His report, filed at the county courthouse, noted, "Farm operations appear normal and well-ordered. Mr. Whitlock cooperated fully with the inspection. No evidence of wrongdoing was discovered. Recommend no further action." However, Halst's personal diary, discovered decades later, tells a different story. "Something is deeply wrong at that farm. Whitlock showed me everything I asked to see, but his manner was too eager, too rehearsed. The workers avoided my eyes. The grinding houses were padlocked, and when I asked to see inside, Whitlock produced keys immediately. But the buildings had clearly been cleaned recently, the floors still damp with lye. The smell of quicklime was overwhelming. When I asked about the Brennan boy, Whitlock's brother, the judge, arrived within minutes, though the farm is 3 miles from town. How did he know to come? The pattern might have remained hidden, if not for Dr. Morton's medical curiosity. In his capacity as county physician, he had been tracking what he called wasting sickness among certain residents, a gradual decline in health affecting those who consumed large quantities of produce from Whitlock's farm. The symptoms were subtle: brittle bones, tooth loss, nervous disorders, and in severe cases, a kind of madness characterized by vivid nightmares and claims of hearing voices in their food. Morton began conducting private experiments. He obtained samples of vegetables from Whitlock's farm and subjected them to chemical analysis using techniques he had learned at Philadelphia Medical College. His notes from January 1856 record his growing horror. The mineral content is abnormal, extraordinarily high levels of calcium phosphate, but of a composition I have never encountered. Under microscopic examination, I discovered what appear to be fragments of processed bone matter, but refined to an almost powder-like consistency. Most disturbing, when I treated the samples with sulfuric acid, the reaction produced not only the expected calcium sulfate, but also traces of what appears to be human dental enamel. God help me, I fear I know what Whitlock's secret ingredient truly is. Dr. Morton faced an impossible situation. His suspicions were monstrous, seemingly impossible. Daniel Whitlock was not just a respected farmer, but a pillar of the community. His brother was a judge with connections to the state capital. To accuse him without absolute proof would mean professional and social ruin. Morton decided he needed irrefutable evidence. On the night of February 28, 1856, Dr. Morton attempted to secretly investigate Whitlock's grinding houses. He left a letter with his wife, to be opened if he didn't return, detailing his suspicions. According to his account, later given in court testimony, he approached the largest of the three structures just after midnight. The padlock had been left unsecured, an oversight by a worker, or perhaps, as Morton later speculated, a trap. What he found inside defied his worst expectations. The grinding house contained a massive stone mill, similar to those used for grain but modified with metal teeth designed to pulverize harder materials. The floor was covered in white powder, finer than flour. Wooden bins along the walls contained what appeared to be sorted bones, some clearly animal, but others unmistakably human. Femurs, ribcages, skulls, all arranged by type and size. A ledger on a dusty table documented processing dates, quantities produced, and field application schedules. But it was the freshest bin that broke Morton's composure. Inside, partially processed, were the remains of what appeared to be a child, based on the size, likely 9 or 10 years old. A distinctive birthmark on a fragment of preserved skin matched the description Thomas Brennan had given of his missing son. Timothy had never left the farm. He had been rendered down and was waiting to be spread across Whitlock's eastern field for the spring planting. Morton fled the grinding house, but in his haste, he knocked over a barrel of quicklime. The crash alerted the farm's night watchman, and soon lanterns were converging on his position. He barely escaped, riding hard back to town with Whitlock's men in pursuit. By dawn, he had gathered Sheriff Halst, Thomas Brennan, and 6 other men, telling them only that he had found evidence of Timothy's murder. He knew that if he revealed the full truth too soon, they might not believe him. The group arrived at Whitlock's farm as the morning sun crested the hills. Whitlock met them at his door, still in his nightshirt but composed as always. When Sheriff Halst demanded to search the grinding houses, Whitlock smiled, an expression Dr. Morton would later describe as the most chilling thing I have ever witnessed on a human face. "By all means, Sheriff," Whitlock said, "but I should warn you we had a fire last night, a terrible accident. The main grinding house is completely destroyed. Such a loss, years of agricultural research reduced to ash." The grinding house was indeed a smoldering ruin. The fire had been thorough, destroying not just the building but any evidence it might have contained. The other 2 structures had been emptied, their floors scrubbed with lye, their equipment dismantled and removed. There was nothing to find. It seemed Daniel Whitlock would escape justice, until the rains came. If this is giving you chills, you're not alone. When I first read Dr. Morton's medical notes, I had to step away from the archives. The systematic nature of what Whitlock was doing, the cold calculation of it all, it's almost beyond comprehension. Please, if you're finding value in these hidden histories, hit that like button and share this video. These stories need to be told. They need to be remembered. We're about to discover together what happens next, and I promise you, the flood that exposed Whitlock's crimes revealed horrors that the original investigators could barely put into words. The documentation gets even more disturbing from here. We're going to see the actual testimony from the survivors, the physical evidence that couldn't be destroyed, and most unsettling of all, we're going to learn that Whitlock wasn't working alone. Let's discover together what really happened when nature itself rebelled against the abomination in those fields. The spring of 1856 brought unprecedented rainfall to western Pennsylvania. Between March 3rd and March 5th, over 7 inches of rain fell on Millbrook County, causing Crimson Creek to overflow its banks for the first time in 20 years. The flooding was catastrophic for many farms, but none more so than Daniel Whitlock's eastern field, where the raging waters carved a new channel directly through his most productive acreage. It was young Marcus Halst, the sheriff's 12-year-old son, who made the initial discovery while searching for his lost dog along the altered creek bed. His sworn testimony, given 2 weeks later, provides the first account. "I saw what I thought were white stones sticking up from the mud where the water had cut through Mr. Whitlock's field. But when I got closer, I saw they weren't stones at all. They were arranged too perfectly, like fence posts in a row. I pulled on one, and it came up with this horrible sucking sound, and there was more attached beneath, like tree roots but white and smooth. That's when I realized I was holding a human arm bone, and all those white stones were the tops of skulls, planted in rows like corn." Sheriff Halst's official report documented 17 complete skeletons discovered in the initial excavation. But the true horror lay in their condition and arrangement. The bodies had been buried vertically, feet down, heads up, at precise 18-inch intervals. Each skeleton showed evidence of systematic processing, marks on the bones consistent with defleshment, holes drilled through major joints, and most disturbingly, the skeletal remains had partially fossilized due to extended exposure to high concentrations of quicklime mixed into the soil. Dr. Morton, brought in to conduct medical examinations, identified several victims from distinctive features. A broken and poorly healed collarbone matched Timothy Brennan. A missing left hand identified Maria Hendricks. A distinctive spinal curvature confirmed the remains of Jonas Nowak. But it was the range of victims that revealed the true scope of Whitlock's selection process. Men, women, and children from various backgrounds, all chosen for what Whitlock's recovered notes would later reveal as their optimal calcium density. The state investigators, summoned from Harrisburg, uncovered a root cellar beneath Whitlock's main barn that had been overlooked in the initial search. Inside, they found what the lead investigator, Detective James Pinkerton, described in his report as an abattoir designed with mechanical precision. The cellar contained a series of metal hooks and chains suspended from reinforced beams, drainage channels carved into the floor leading to collection basins, specialized tools modified from veterinary and butcher equipment, 37 glass jars containing preserved tissue samples, each meticulously labeled with names, dates, and notations about mineral content, a leather-bound journal containing detailed processing records for 43 individuals over 19 years. The journal, written in Whitlock's precise hand, revealed the evolution of his methods. The first entry, dated August 1837, described his initial experiment. The Negro vagrant proved unsuitable, too old, bones brittle, poor yield. Must select younger specimens for optimal calcium extraction. The process requires 48 hours of lime treatment before grinding. Note: complete desiccation essential to prevent spoilage. Field results are extremely promising, corn stalks showing 35% increased growth rate. As the entries progressed, Whitlock's language became increasingly clinical, discussing human beings as agricultural inputs. He developed a classification system rating potential victims on factors including age, health, diet, and even emotional state at time of death. He believed fear enhanced certain chemical properties beneficial to plant growth. By 1845, he had perfected what he called his rendering process. Subject suspended inverted for complete blood drainage, minimum 6 hours. Initial butchering must separate major muscle groups for separate processing. Soft tissue for immediate application as nitrogen source. Organs for liquid fertilizer production. Bones require a 72-hour lime bath before grinding. Optimal particle size achieved through 3-stage grinding process. The final product should pass through silk mesh. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was a series of contracts found in a hidden compartment of Whitlock's desk. These documents revealed that Whitlock was not operating alone, but was part of what they called the Agricultural Innovation Society, a network of 12 farmers across Pennsylvania, Ohio, Maryland, and New York who had been sharing techniques for enhanced fertilization methods. The contracts included shipment records showing that Whitlock had been selling his processed fertilizer to society members at premium prices, $50 per hundredweight, nearly 20 times the cost of standard bone meal. The buyers included prominent names: Josiah Hartwell of Syracuse, New York, Bernard Kohler of Cincinnati, Ohio, Thomas Ashford of Baltimore, Maryland. Each had experienced similar miraculous improvements in their crop yields. One recovered letter from Hartwell to Whitlock, dated December 1855, stated, "Your latest shipment produced extraordinary results. My wheat field yielded 60 bushels per acre, double the county average. The quality is beyond comparison. I require double the quantity for spring planting. I trust you can accommodate this request without compromising the quality of your product. Remember, discretion remains paramount to our mutual success." The investigation revealed that Whitlock had developed an entire logistics system for victim acquisition. He targeted transients, immigrants, and others whose disappearances would attract minimal attention. He employed a network of informants, tavern keepers, ferry operators, and even a clerk at the county registry, who would alert him to suitable candidates passing through the region. Payment records showed regular disbursements to these individuals, labeled as payments for agricultural supplies or consulting services. 3 survivors were discovered during the investigation, imprisoned in a concealed basement beneath one of the secondary grinding houses. Margaret O'Brien, aged 19, had been held for 6 days. Her testimony revealed Whitlock's final evolution. He had begun keeping victims alive longer, feeding them specific diets he believed would enhance their eventual contribution to his soil. She described being forced to consume massive quantities of milk and ground oyster shells, which Whitlock explained would improve her essence. The 2 other survivors, a Polish immigrant named Stanislaw Kowalski and a 10-year-old orphan girl known only as Sarah, were in advanced states of malnutrition and psychological trauma. Kowalski's testimony, given through a translator, described watching Whitlock process other victims. He would speak to them as he worked, explaining how they would nourish the earth, how their sacrifice would feed hundreds. He seemed to believe he was performing a sacred duty. He would say, "From dust you came, to dust you return, but through my intervention you shall become the bread of life itself." The man was not simply evil. He had convinced himself he was a prophet of some agricultural gospel. Physical evidence collected from the farm revealed the industrial scale of Whitlock's operation. Investigators found over 2,000 pounds of processed bone meal stored in various locations, mechanical grinding equipment capable of processing 500 pounds of material daily, detailed maps marking where different victims had been applied to fields, with notes on resulting crop performance, chemical equipment for testing soil composition and product quality. a collection of medical and anatomical texts, heavily annotated with Whitlock's agricultural applications. Dr. Morton's continued investigation of those who had consumed produce from Whitlock's farm revealed a pattern of illness that he termed anthropophagic toxicity. Essentially, the medical consequences of unwitting cannibalism. Many showed elevated levels of prion diseases, similar to what would later be identified in cases of Kuru. The psychological impact on the community was devastating. Hundreds of families realized they had been unknowingly participating in Whitlock's atrocity with every meal. The most disturbing revelation came from an encrypted section of Whitlock's journal, decoded by a professor of mathematics from the University of Pennsylvania. Here, Whitlock described his ultimate vision, a transformation of American agriculture where human remains would become the primary fertilizer source. He had calculated that the annual death rate in the United States could provide sufficient material to revolutionize farm productivity. He wrote, "Society wastes its most precious resource, the minerals and nutrients contained within our own deceased. Ancient cultures understood this truth, practicing ritual cannibalism not from savagery, but from wisdom. I have simply industrialized this process, removing the primitive consumption and utilizing modern scientific methods to return human essence to the food chain in its most efficient form. Future generations will recognize me not as a monster, but as a visionary who solved the crisis of soil depletion that threatens our civilization." The final horror was discovered when investigators, acting on information in Whitlock's records, excavated portions of 12 other fields across his property. They found remains of at least 60 additional victims, bringing the total confirmed dead to 77. However, discrepancies between Whitlock's records and physical evidence suggested the actual number might exceed 100. Many of the older remains had been so thoroughly integrated into the soil that individual identification was impossible. The arrest of Daniel Whitlock on March 12, 1856, triggered a series of events that would expose a conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of Pennsylvania society. Within hours of his detention, Judge Harrison Whitlock arrived at the county jail with 2 attorneys from Philadelphia and a writ of habeas corpus demanding his brother's immediate release. The judge argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the bones could have been from medical specimens or indigenous burial grounds, and that his brother was being persecuted for his agricultural success. Sheriff Magnus Halst, facing pressure from Judge Whitlock and knowing he was outmatched legally, made a crucial decision. He secretly telegraphed the U.S. Marshal's office in Philadelphia, invoking federal jurisdiction based on the interstate commerce of human remains. The response came from Marshal Theodore Blackwood, a former Union intelligence officer who arrived in Millbrook County with 6 deputies on March 15th. Blackwood's investigation methodology was methodical and immune to local political pressure. He immediately seized all records from the Agricultural Exchange building, where he discovered something Sheriff Halst had missed: a series of coded telegrams between Agricultural Innovation Society members dating back 3 years. The code was simple but effective, using agricultural terms to disguise their true meaning. Seed stock meant potential victims. Harvest ready indicated a shipment of processed remains, and soil testing referred to the recruitment of new members. The telegrams revealed that Judge Harrison Whitlock was not merely protecting his brother, but was an active participant in the conspiracy. He had used his political connections to suppress investigations, destroy records, and relocate witnesses. One decoded message from the judge to a society member in Baltimore read, "3 seed stocks dispatched via railway. Harvest ready in 10 days. Ensure soil testing is complete before spring season." As news of the investigation spread, threats against the investigators began immediately. Dr. Morton found a note nailed to his door. "Some knowledge is better left buried. Your family's health depends on your silence." Sheriff Halst's wife received a package containing a child's shoe filled with white powder and a card reading, "Your son could contribute so much to next season's harvest." Marshall Blackwood himself survived an attempted poisoning at the local tavern. The cook later confessed that Judge Whitlock had paid him $50 to add special seasoning to the Marshall's meal. The investigation expanded when Blackwood's team raided the farms of other Agricultural Innovation Society members. In Syracuse, New York, Josiah Hartwell's property yielded 15 bodies in various stages of processing. Bernard Kohler's farm in Cincinnati contained an even more sophisticated operation, including steam-powered grinding equipment and a chemical laboratory for product refinement. Each location revealed improvements on Whitlock's original methods, suggesting an active exchange of technical knowledge among society members. Most disturbing was the discovery at Thomas Ashford's estate in Baltimore. Beyond the expected processing facilities, investigators found a boarding school for orphans that Ashford had been operating as a charitable institution. The school's records showed that over 7 years, 43 children had been admitted, but only 12 could be accounted for. The others had allegedly been adopted by farming families out west. No forwarding addresses, no correspondence, no trace. Detective Pinkerton, leading the Baltimore investigation, uncovered correspondence between Ashford and European contacts. Letters written in German and French, when translated, revealed that the Agricultural Innovation Society had international connections. A Professor Heinrich Zimmermann from the University of Heidelberg had been providing scientific guidance on mineral extraction from human remains, while a French agricultural theorist named Claude Beaumont had supplied documents from medieval monasteries describing similar practices during plague years, when corpses were ground into meal and used to fertilize monastery gardens. The European connection led to an even more chilling discovery. The society members weren't simply criminals, but adherents to a philosophical movement they called anthropocentric agriculture, the belief that human beings, as the apex of creation, contained essential spiritual and chemical properties that, when returned to the soil, would produce food imbued with enhanced nutritional and metaphysical qualities. They cited ancient practices from various cultures: Aztec sacrifice gardens, certain Tibetan burial customs, and references to cannibalistic agriculture in Roman accounts of Germanic tribes. A manifesto found in Whitlock's possession, titled "The Sacred Cycle of Consumption," outlined their ultimate goal: the establishment of perfected farms across America where the deceased would be systematically processed into agricultural inputs. They envisioned a future where death would be reimagined as a contribution to collective nourishment, where yards would be replaced by processing facilities, and where humanity would achieve immortality through perpetual recirculation through the food chain. The investigation revealed that the society had been infiltrating agricultural colleges and farmers' associations across the eastern United States. Professor Marcus Thornhill of the Philadelphia Agricultural College, who had been Daniel Whitlock's mentor, was arrested when investigators found preserved human organs in his laboratory, which he had been using to conduct nutritional enhancement experiments. His research notes indicated he had been working on methods to concentrate specific human hormones and minerals for targeted crop enhancement. Financial records exposed a complex web of investors who had been unknowingly funding the society's expansion. Several prominent Philadelphia and New York banking families had invested in what they believed was an innovative fertilizer company. The Premium Soil Enhancement Corporation, incorporated in Delaware in 1852, had raised over $100,000 in capital for expansion of production facilities. The investors included 2 state senators, a railroad magnate, and ironically, the president of the Pennsylvania Humanitarian Society. Resistance to the investigation intensified as its scope broadened. Judge Whitlock used his influence to have Marshal Blackwood recalled to Philadelphia, but Blackwood refused the order, claiming federal authority superseded state directives. An attempt to burn the county courthouse, where evidence was being stored, was thwarted by vigilant townspeople who had formed a protective committee. The state attorney general, Lawrence Pemberton, arrived personally to take control of the prosecution, only to be discovered later that evening attempting to remove key documents from evidence storage. The society's reach extended into law enforcement itself. Deputy Marshal James Crawford, one of Blackwood's most trusted men, was caught attempting to poison Daniel Whitlock in his cell, not to kill him, but to render him mentally incompetent before trial. Under interrogation, Crawford revealed he had been recruited by the society 2 years earlier and promised vast wealth once their agricultural revolution succeeded. He had been tasked with monitoring federal interest in missing persons cases that might lead back to society members. The investigation's darkest revelation came from a society member who turned state's evidence in exchange for immunity. Dr. Cornelius Ashby, a physician from Trenton, New Jersey, revealed that the society had been conducting controlled experiments on isolated communities. They had been supplying prisons, poorhouses, and insane asylums with produce grown using their methods, carefully documenting the effects on the inhabitants. The results, he claimed, showed increased docility, enhanced susceptibility to suggestion, and in some cases, a form of addiction where subjects would refuse to eat anything else. Ashby's testimony revealed that the society believed they were creating a new form of human, one that existed in symbiosis with their agricultural system. Consumers of their produce would, over generations, develop a biological dependency on human-enhanced food, creating a self-perpetuating cycle where death became merely a transition in an eternal agricultural process. They had even developed breeding programs, selecting individuals with optimal chemical profiles for eventual processing. By April 1856, the investigation had identified over 200 individuals connected to the Agricultural Innovation Society across 7 states. The full extent of their operations suggested that between 1840 and 1856, as many as 1,000 people might have been processed into agricultural products. The contamination of the food supply was impossible to calculate. Produce from society farms had been shipped to markets from Boston to Richmond, potentially affecting tens of thousands of consumers. Just when we thought we'd seen the depths of human depravity, the investigation reveals something even more terrifying. This wasn't just murder. It was an attempt to fundamentally alter the human relationship with food and death itself. These men weren't simply killers. They were true believers in a twisted agricultural apocalypse. If this investigation into America's darkest agricultural secret has gripped you, please share this video before it's too late. The descendants of these families have worked hard to keep these records buried, and every share helps ensure this history isn't forgotten again. We're building more than just an audience here. We're creating a true crime family dedicated to uncovering the horrors that others want hidden. Your comments and theories about how far this conspiracy really went help us investigate further. Some of you have already pointed out suspicious agricultural success stories in your own communities from this era. Keep those observations coming. What happens next? The trial, the verdicts, and the horrifying fate of those who escaped justice will challenge everything you thought you knew about American justice in the 19th century. The trial of Daniel Whitlock and his co-conspirators began on May 12, 1856, in the Harrisburg Circuit Court, presided over by Judge Thaddeus Cornwall, specially appointed by the governor to avoid conflicts of interest. The courthouse was surrounded by National Guard troops after 3 attempts by mobs to lynch the defendants. Though notably, other crowds had gathered to support Whitlock, believing him to be a persecuted visionary. The prosecution, led by State Attorney General Samuel Hartley, Lawrence Pemberton having been removed after his attempt to tamper with evidence, faced immediate challenges. 3 key witnesses disappeared before trial, including the translator for Stanislaw Kowalski, who was found floating in the Susquehanna River. Margaret O'Brien, the survivor whose testimony was considered crucial, suffered a mysterious illness that left her unable to speak above a whisper. Dr. Morton later suspected poisoning but could never prove it. Daniel Whitlock's defense, funded by anonymous benefactors later revealed to be society members who had evaded arrest, argued on 3 fronts: insanity, scientific necessity, and remarkably, religious freedom. His lead attorney, Bartholomew Crane of Boston, claimed that Whitlock suffered from a delusional disorder that made him believe he was performing God's work. When this failed to persuade, Crane pivoted to arguing that Whitlock's actions, while regrettable, had advanced agricultural science in ways that would benefit humanity for generations. The religious freedom argument was the most audacious. Crane presented documents suggesting that the Agricultural Innovation Society was actually a religious organization practicing a form of agricultural spiritualism protected under the First Amendment. He compared their practices to communion, arguing that they were simply literalizing the transformation of human essence into sustaining bread. Daniel Whitlock's testimony, given over 3 days, revealed a mind that had completely rationalized mass murder. He spoke eloquently about soil depletion, the coming agricultural crisis, and his role as a pioneer of necessity. When asked about his victims, he corrected the prosecutor. "Not victims, sir, participants in a grander design. Every person who nourished my fields lives on in every grain of wheat, every ear of corn. They have achieved a form of immortality that your conventional burial denies." The most damning evidence came from young Timothy Brennan's father, Thomas, who had conducted his own investigation. He presented the court with samples from Whitlock's fields tested by 3 independent chemists, all confirming human remains in the soil. He also produced a letter Whitlock had written but never sent, detailing plans to process at least 50 units before the next harvest. On May 28th, after 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts for Daniel Whitlock on 17 counts of murder, only those bodies that could be positively identified. The cases involving the additional 60 victims found on his property were deemed insufficient for individual prosecution due to inability to establish identity or exact cause of death. This technicality would haunt the families of the unidentified victims for generations. Judge Harrison Whitlock's trial was more complex. Despite clear evidence of his involvement, his knowledge of legal procedures allowed him to exploit every technicality. Key evidence mysteriously disappeared from custody, witnesses recanted testimony claiming coercion, and 3 jurors were dismissed for external influence. In the end, Harrison was convicted only of conspiracy and tampering with evidence, receiving 10 years imprisonment, a sentence many considered insultingly light. The trials of other Agricultural Innovation Society members produced mixed results. Josiah Hartwell of Syracuse fled to Canada before arrest and was never extradited. Bernard Kohler was found dead in his cell before trial, apparently suicide by ingestion of his own processed fertilizer, though guards reported seeing an unknown visitor shortly before his death. Thomas Ashford of Baltimore was convicted of murder, but his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment after Maryland political figures intervened, citing his previous charitable works. Of the 200 identified society members and collaborators, only 43 were brought to trial. 17 were convicted of murder, 24 of conspiracy or accessory charges, and 2 were acquitted. The rest fled, died under suspicious circumstances, or simply vanished into the expanding American frontier. Professor Heinrich Zimmermann in Germany and Claude Beaumont in France were never prosecuted, their governments refusing extradition for agricultural theoretical discussions. Daniel Whitlock was sentenced to death by hanging, scheduled for July 4, 1856, Independence Day, a date chosen for its symbolic value. However, on the night of July 2nd, Whitlock escaped from the Harrisburg State Prison under circumstances that remain mysterious. Guards claimed he simply vanished from his cell, leaving behind only a note. The seed is planted. The harvest is inevitable. The search for Whitlock became a national manhunt. Sightings were reported from Texas to Oregon, but none confirmed. In 1858, a man matching his description was allegedly seen boarding a ship to Argentina, where German agricultural colonies were being established. The Pinkerton Detective Agency maintained an open file on him until 1892, when they declared him presumed dead. The surviving victims faced difficult paths. Margaret O'Brien, whose voice never fully recovered, became an advocate for missing persons investigations, establishing one of America's first victim advocacy organizations. The orphan Sarah was adopted by Dr. Morton and his wife, though she suffered night terrors for the rest of her life. Stanislaw Kowalski returned to Poland, but not before providing detailed testimony that helped convict 12 society members. The societal impact was profound. Pennsylvania passed the Whitlock laws, requiring regular inspection of fertilizer production facilities and criminalizing the use of human remains in agriculture. The Methodist and Presbyterian churches in Millbrook County conducted mass blessing ceremonies for all food, a practice that continued until the 1920s. Many families who had consumed produce from Whitlock's farm reported psychosomatic illnesses for years, unable to eat vegetables without experiencing nausea. The economic impact was severe but localized. The Pennsylvania Agricultural Society disbanded in shame, reforming 2 years later with strict ethical guidelines. Property values in Millbrook County plummeted as the area became known as Cannibal County. The Whitlock farm itself was burned by vigilantes in 1857, the land subsequently lying fallow for 30 years, until a Catholic monastery purchased it for a cemetery. believing sacred ground might purify the corrupted soil. Dr. Elias Morton spent his remaining years studying the medical effects of consuming produce grown with human remains. His research, published posthumously in 1871, identified several prion diseases and mineral toxicities that wouldn't be fully understood by medical science for another century. He documented over 300 cases of what he called Whitlock syndrome, a combination of physical and psychological symptoms affecting those who had consumed contaminated produce. Financial investigations revealed that the Agricultural Innovation Society had accumulated assets worth over $500,000 through their operations. Attempts to compensate victims' families were mired in legal challenges for decades. Much of the money simply disappeared, likely funding the escape and resettlement of society members who evaded justice. Perhaps most disturbing were the unanswered questions that lingered. Sheriff Halst's final report noted discrepancies between Whitlock's records and the number of missing persons in the region, suggesting additional victims never documented. Several prominent families in Pennsylvania and New York showed suspicious agricultural success in subsequent years, but investigations were blocked by political influence. 3 federal investigators assigned to track fleeing society members disappeared themselves, their cases never solved. In 1867, a farmer in Minnesota discovered human remains processed into fertilizer in his newly purchased barn. In 1871, similar discoveries were made in California and Oregon. Each time, local authorities found connections to Pennsylvania Dutch farmers who had arrived within the previous decade, but none could be definitively linked to the original Agricultural Innovation Society. The pattern suggested that the practice had not died with Whitlock's capture, but had simply moved underground, spreading like a disease across America's expanding agricultural frontier. The Whitlock case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the American agricultural revolution and the price of progress. While we celebrate the 19th century as an era of innovation and expansion, the Agricultural Innovation Society represents the dark extreme of utilitarian thinking, the reduction of human beings to their chemical components in service of efficiency and yield. What enabled such systematic horror to flourish for nearly 2 decades? The answer lies not in individual madness, but in systemic blindness. The isolated nature of rural communities, the desperate need for agricultural success, and the implicit trust in social hierarchies created perfect conditions for predation. When respectable men in positions of authority vouched for one another, who would question their methods? When revolutionary agricultural techniques produced undeniable results, who would investigate their origins too closely? The psychological impact on American society was profound, but largely unacknowledged. The possibility that anyone might have unknowingly participated in cannibalism through consuming contaminated produce created a collective trauma that historians have only recently begun to examine. The phrase, "you are what you eat," took on horrifying new meaning for thousands of families across the Northeast and Midwest. Dr. Morton's posthumous analysis suggested that the Whitlock conspiracy revealed a fundamental vulnerability in human civilization, our complete dependence on trust in food production. We cannot individually verify the origin and composition of everything we consume. We must rely on others' ethics and oversight. The Agricultural Innovation Society exploited this trust with scientific precision, hiding their atrocities behind the veil of agricultural advancement. Modern agricultural historians have identified disturbing parallels between the society's rhetoric and certain contemporary movements. The emphasis on efficiency over ethics, the reduction of complex moral questions to simple yield calculations, and the willingness to sacrifice individual welfare for supposed collective benefit. These patterns repeat throughout history in various forms. Professor Amanda Richardson of Cornell University argues that the Whitlock case was not an aberration, but an extreme manifestation of attitudes that persist in industrial agriculture. Why was this story buried for so long? The answer involves a combination of shame, fear, and deliberate suppression. Prominent families discovered their ancestors were either victims, consumers, or worse, investors in the Agricultural Innovation Society. The Pennsylvania Historical Commission actively discouraged research into the case until the 1970s. Land deeds, court records, and personal testimonies were frequently lost or destroyed in suspicious fires. Even today, certain agricultural corporations with historical ties to the era resist investigations into their founding members. The recent discovery of the sealed records in Harrisburg was no accident. It came during renovation work mandated by historical preservation laws that powerful interests could no longer prevent. Among these documents was correspondence showing that as late as 1923, state officials were still tracking suspected Agricultural Innovation Society members and their descendants, suggesting the practice may have continued far longer than officially acknowledged. Perhaps most chilling is evidence that Whitlock's ideas didn't die with him. Agricultural extension reports from the 1870s through 1890s occasionally reference mysterious fertilizer mixtures producing exceptional results, always in areas with significant German immigrant populations. The fact that these reports abruptly cease after 1895 suggests either the practice ended or became sophisticated enough to avoid detection entirely. The Whitlock legacy challenges us to examine what we're willing to ignore in exchange for prosperity, what questions we're afraid to ask about our food systems, and how easily scientific progress can be perverted into mechanized horror. In our modern era of industrial agriculture, genetic modification, and synthetic biology, the ethical questions raised by the Agricultural Innovation Society remain disturbingly relevant. So I leave you with this thought-provoking question. If Daniel Whitlock's agricultural methods had been discovered to cause no human illness, if the only crime was the source of his fertilizer, would society have stopped him? Or would the extraordinary yields have been too valuable to sacrifice? What do you think really happened to the society members who escaped? Could their descendants still be operating under new names, with new methods, in places we'd never suspect? The parallels to modern industrial agriculture are impossible to ignore. When we don't question where our food comes from, when we prioritize yield over ethics, when we trust without verifying, we create the conditions for another Whitlock to emerge. If this deep dive into America's most disturbing agricultural secret has affected you, please subscribe to our channel. We have more hidden histories coming, including next week's investigation into the Chicago meat processing disappearances of 1891, a case with disturbing connections to what you've learned today. Share this video with someone brave enough to handle the truth. The fact that powerful interests tried to keep these records buried for 167 years tells us one thing: someone still has something to hide. Thank you for joining me on this dark journey through American history. You've proven you're one of the brave ones, willing to face the horrifying truths that others would rather forget. Until next time, this is your guide to America's hidden horrors, reminding you that the past is never as distant as we'd like to believe. And sometimes, the most fertile ground holds the darkest secrets. Remember to check your local historical societies. You never know what sealed records might be waiting in forgotten basements, desperate to reveal their truths after more than a century of silence. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and always question what you're being fed, literally and figuratively.